Our final presentation in world history, we decided to research and present about the development of the plantation system in the Caribbean islands. This video is by Alexis Ranjabar, Nicole Roberts, Connor Tennis, Holland Templeton, and Brady Smart.
Sugar was the main crop on plantations through the Caribbean through the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Most of the islands were covered with sugarcane and mills for refining. It was the main source of labor until the abolition of the system with African slaves. These plantations produced about 80 to 90% of sugar consumed in Western Europe. Sugar was a very important crop for the Caribbean islands. Sugarcane was grown relatively on flat land that was near the coast. The soil used to grow the sugarcane was naturally yellow. The sugarcane was brought around the 17th century to what later became the British West Indies. During the colonial period, the arrival of sugar culture deeply impacted the society and economy in the Caribbean. They encouraged the local growers to change the main crop from cotton and tobacco to sugarcane, due to the stiff competition from the North Americas. This led to a big upburst in the Caribbean economy. Slave overview. There's a dramatic increase in the ratio of slaves to freemen, but also an increase in the average size of slave plantation. Early sugar plantations made extensive use of slaves because sugar was considered a cash crop that exhibited economies of scale in cultivation. During the main season, some slaves would work about 48 hours without getting a break. Roughly about 25% of slaves would die within 3 years of their arrival. Because of the terrible treatment of slaves, many revolts and violence across the Caribbean occurred. Black men and women were forcibly taken from Africa and made into slaves to work on these plantations. Overall, about 1.6 million slaves were taken to work in British Caribbean colonies. Trading patterns. The main destination ports for ships loaded with sugar were Bristol and Liverpool. In 1785, about 22,811 barrels of sugar were imported through Bristol. The last leg of the triangle trade was the return back to Bristol, known as the Return Passage. Once they traded for enslaved Africans that were taken across the Atlantic Ocean to European-owned plantations in America and the Caribbean. They had sold their cargo of slaves. Ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean back on their journey to Bristol. Ships were filled with slaves and also barrels of sugar, rum, and tobacco.
Voyage to the Caribbean islands. The overview. An average ship transferred around between 200 to 600 slaves into the Caribbean island. In that timeline, over 3.1 million slaves were transferred this way, and due to the high rates in every slave ship voyage, all dead bodies were thrown out into the sea in order to reduce the spread of diseases. It took an average of 1 to 2 months, depending on which country in Europe, to sail into the Caribbean islands. The slave conditions on this voyage. On the ship, male slaves were given no freedom and forced into the hull of the ship in shackles. Each one had around 5 inches of space between one and another. They remained there for the majority of the voyage until said otherwise. The female and children lived in separate quarters and had the freedom to go on the deck. However, this ended up in violence and sexual abuse from the sailors. All slaves were given 2 meals per day with limited water. Most food on this voyage were either infected or given to animals. If the weather conditions were good, they allowed slaves to roam around on the deck. However, they were either to work or forced them to exercise. Any slave not obeying their leader will receive physical punishment, in which most cases result in death. No clothing were given to any slaves during the voyage. Health hazards on the ship. The air on the cargo ships were foul and putrid due to the closeness between each slave, the heat of the climate, and how many there were on the ship. Because of this, it was common for slaves to be either seasick or dehydrated during the voyage. No plumbing services were given to the slaves, so they would be left to throwing their waste either overboard or simply leaving it. Because of the health issues aboard, most slaves were either infected or died due to the health issues while on board. Such diseases include fever, dysentery, in which case the flux, and smallpox.
Once in the Caribbean, there was a division among people. The demographic revolution had a really important social consequence. There were class and castes made in the Caribbean. There were 3 basic divisions. The first, the free white people living on the Caribbean. Second, free non-white people working on the Caribbean. And third, the slaves who had to work for the free white people and who had to obey orders from them. Whites were divided along status based on wealth. The first rank was British colonies. These were called principal whites. And they also had poor whites. Following 3 ranks, there were top families who owned slaves in successful plantations. And then there was the next rank, which was merchants, officials such as professionals, doctors, and clergymen. And then the bottom was the poor whites. They were small, independent farmers, servants, day laborers. The importance of race and color was significant variation from normals of typical European society. It accentuated the divergence between society at home, as in Europe, and that overseas.
Life as a slave. Between 1766 and 1791, the British West Indies produced over 1 million tons of sugar. Growing sugar was hard, labor-intensive work that slaves had to encounter every day. Sugar was produced in the following way. The ground had to be dug, hoed, weeded, planted, and then fertilized with manure, all under the hot, brutal sun. Slave groups consisting of men, women, and children worked as their owners watched. They were whipped for not working hard enough. Slaves worked from dawn until dusk. Roles of a slave. At harvest time, sugarcane was cut with machetes, and the heavy canes had to be loaded into carts and bins. The cane was taken to the sugar mill where it was crushed and boiled to extract a brown, sticky juice. Operating the machinery was very dangerous. Slaves could be maimed or even killed. The slave bulling houses were unbearably hot and difficult to work in during the summer. And also, at harvest time, it was common for slaves to work 18-hour days, while some worked for as long as 48 hours without a break. The sugar juice was left in barrels until a brown syrup called molasses could be drawn off. This was used to make another of the Caribbean exports, rum. The clear sugar was left behind, which would then be packed into barrels and shipped to Europe. The juice taken from the crushed sugar cane would sour and spoil within 24 hours, so the slaves had to process it in the cane mills as soon as it was produced. The need for slaves. Sugar production was labor intensive. The increased demand led Europeans to forcibly transport Africans as slaves. In 1746, economist Malachi Postlethwaite wrote, "If we have no Negroes, we can have no sugar, tobacco, rum, etc." Consequently, the public revenue arising from the importation of plantation produce will be wiped out, and hundreds of thousands of Britons making goods for the triangular trade will lose their jobs and go a-begging. Many agreed with him, believing that the slave-based plantation system was vital to British wealth, industry, and jobs. Slave labor. The plantation economies of the New World were built on slave labor. The huge profits to be made by European merchants drove the continuation of the slave trade until its abolition in 1807. Buying slaves was expensive, but the profits for their labor outweighed the cost. Approximately 70% of slaves were brought to the New World to produce sugar, the most labor-intensive crop. The rest were employed in harvesting coffee, cotton, and tobacco. Sugar growing was labor-intensive, requiring many slaves to make it profitable. The rich planters could also afford to work enslaved people to death and then buy more. Profits from slave labor. By far, the West Indian colonies were the most financially profitable. A handful of British individuals became planters and made large fortunes from owning slaves. This advantage was reinforced when France lost its most important colony, Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, to a slave revolt in 1791. After 1791, the British Caribbean islands produced the most sugar, and the British people quickly became the largest consumers. West Indian sugar became commonplace as an additive to tea. Also, the profits of slavery were plowed back into the economy and helped to develop industry in Britain and its colonies. Manchester became an important textile center. Factories made cloth from cheap slave-picked cotton. Much of this cotton cloth was sold back to Africans in return for more slaves. Between 1630 and 1807, Britain's slaves merchants made a profit of about 12 million on the purchase and sale of African people. Slaves produced about 75% of exports of raw goods from the new colonies.
Effects on the Caribbean. In the 17th and 18th centuries, slaves were moved from Africa to the West Indies to work on sugar plantations. This industry and the slave trade made British ports and merchants involved very wealthy and had long-lasting effects on native peoples. The slave trade did not only have a negative impact on Africa, it had a long-lasting and major effects on the Caribbean too. The native people, known as the Arawaks, were wiped out by European diseases and eventually were replaced by West Africans. Pictured to the right are the indigenous people of the Caribbean before colonization and the slave trade. When Europeans reached the Caribbean, the native Arawaks were forced to be slaves on their own land. Soon after European colonization of the islands, the native people began to die off due to their weak immune system. Old world diseases such as smallpox wiped out the indigenous people. The native people also lost their land. The Arawak people lost all of their land to Europeans, and it was sold for products of sale to benefit Europe's economy. Due to the large plantations that were needed to be built, much of the indigenous wildlife and land was destroyed and never recovered. When African slaves were brought over to the islands, there was a large population increase, which led to low supplies of food and water for survival. With the arrival of Europeans and Africans, the Arawak people lost touch with their culture. A new culture was forced upon them by Europeans and Africans, and the Voodoo religion was one of them. The Voodoo religion is a religion created from a mixture of African religion and French Catholicism in the island of Haiti. A little bit about the cultural influences in French Caribbean territories. Haitian culture was the most prevalent example of an exchange of ideas from Africa to the Americas. The culture has an exceptionally strong African as well as Taino and European elements due to the French colonization of Saint-Domingue and the import of Africans to the religion. The Arawak influence, when met with African and European religious traditions, created perhaps the most well-known Caribbean tradition, Voodoo, as recently spoken about. To the left is a picture of the Haitian Voodoo ritual. You can see people dancing in colorful skirts and drums. To the right are some examples of paintings of the slave revolt and what it was like. A little bit more about the culture in English-controlled Caribbean territories. In the English-controlled regions, including Jamaica, less African native culture is evident today. This is because of the manner in which the plantations were run, and the fact that the English made a strong effort to disconnect the enslaved people from their native traditions. The colorful African culture still shows today in many Jamaican traditions, especially in their cuisine. During slavery, plantation owners decided what kind of shelter and medical care was given to their slaves. But after the abolition of slavery, most available work was on the very same plantations that former enslaved people had worked on. The wages were low and people had inadequate rights to land. Rent and taxes were high, and so was unemployment. Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica is an example of the working class protesting about such conditions. Another adverse effect of the slave trade was the damage to the Caribbean economies due to the concentration of the sugar production. The lasting effects of colonization are still felt as these countries try to recover their own cultures, which are effectively wiped out by colonial domination. The wealth and power accumulated by the rich Western world still makes it difficult for colonized countries to become truly self-sufficient financially. From the middle to late 1800s, the Caribbean saw many changes. Colonial governments reinforced judicial systems, police forces, education, and health care. They built roads and railways, developed botanical gardens, improved water supplies and sanitation. They also established cable communication. Authorities introduced mass vaccinations against common diseases and provided relief following natural disasters. Throughout the Caribbean, mental health institutions often suffered from poor standards of care, overcrowding, and patient neglect. By the 1870s, many islands were constructing new facilities and attempting to improve patient care. The schooling system established during slavery was expanded to teach Christian morals to the recently freed slaves. Later, academic and agricultural schools were instituted by the state. The Miko Charity was an important educational trust that established schools in the British Caribbean. A little bit about the cultural impacts of the Caribbean plantations' life on North America. While heavily influenced by the French due to their origins, the Creole people, especially those in the northern United States, draw many similarities to Haitians, especially in terms of their culture and diet. The primary similarity to African imported peoples lies in the tradition of the voodoo, however, also their diet. The Creole people of Louisiana are considered their own ethnic group, as well as having their own language that consists of elements of French, Spanish, African, and Native American roots. Still today, Louisiana is a very special place to visit in the United States, especially for their culture. To the right is a picture of the Louisiana Creole flag. You can see many elements of the French and African elements as well. The effect that slavery left on the Caribbean islands will forever be long-lasting. Some Caribbean islands continue to demand compensation for Caribbean colonists for what they did. Governments in various islands believe that countries such as Britain should apologize for the impact of the slave trade and do something about it. Thank you so much for watching our presentation on slave trade in the Caribbean. We really enjoyed researching about this project and learned a lot from it.